Today on the Greg Base, we're continuing our RV lithium battery upgrade. We'll take everything we learned last time and start building our battery. So let's get started. Last time, we started the process of upgrading our travel trailer to use lithium batteries. We wanted to do more dry camping, but our stock batteries just weren't up to it. Because we wanted the most bang for the buck, and because I love a good project, we decided to build the lithium batteries ourselves. In the first video, I went over the basics of what you need to know about lithium batteries when they're used in RVs. And in this video, I'll buy my parts, design the battery, and build it from start to finish, and hopefully have a working battery ready to install in our trailer. Before we jump in, let's quickly review what we're trying to build. We're looking to build a pretty mild system, one that'll fit in a small trailer and let us go dry camping for a few days at a time. If you have a smaller trailer or you don't plan on going off-grid camping full time, chances are this system will work pretty good for you too. We want at least 150 amp hours of usable capacity so that we can go at least a full day without having to recharge. For now, we're only powering 12 volt loads that top out at around 30 amps, so no inverter. And our RV's converter tops out at about 45 amps of charge current. We want to mount the batteries in the stock location so we don't use up any storage space inside the trailer. That does mean we'll have to be aware of any space limitations when we design the battery and we choose our battery box. And finally, we want this battery to be tough and simple so that it's easy to build up front, but also so that it's tough enough to stand up the vibrations of driving down the road, and if something goes wrong, that we can repair it in the field with simple tools. With all of that in mind, our plan is to build two 100 amp hour batteries rather than one large battery. This will give us 200 amp hours of power, which more than meets our power requirements. And a lithium battery of this size will more than handle our 30 amp load or a 45 amp charge current. Having two smaller batteries will also make it easier for us to expand the system if we wanted to add another 100 amp hours of capacity later. And having two batteries also gives us some redundancy, which is really nice when dry camping. So if one battery was to fail for some reason, you still have the other battery to get you home. As we discussed in the last video, there are a whole bunch of options for cells, whether small or large, new or used. But because we want our battery to be as simple and tough as possible, we're going with just 4 cells per battery. These are brand new 100 amp hour CALB CA series cells that I got through AliExpress. These CALB cells are not the smallest or the lightest cells out there, but they are rugged, proven cells, and they come extremely well packaged. Using just 4 large cells per battery means we don't have to mess around making 3.6 volt parallel sub-packs out of smaller cells before we can get to assembling our battery. We'll be able to just assemble these 4 cells in series to get up to our 14.4 volt pack voltage. Also, because there's going to be fewer connections between the cells, that's fewer points of failure in the future. One of the other great things about these cells is that they have these threaded terminals, which means no spot welding. And they come with this hardware kit that includes bolts and these terminal caps, and even these really high quality bus bars, which means I don't have to mess around with hammering a piece of copper pipe flat to try to make my own. Beyond just wiring them together, we need to hold the cells physically together so that they can't move around and stress the electrical connections. I've seen people use everything from tape to hose clamps to hold them together, but we're going to do something a little nicer and make a custom bracket that wraps all the way around and clamps here in the front securely with screws. That'll also give us a really natural location to mount our BMS that will still let us route our balance leads and other wires up to these battery terminals. And speaking of the BMS, on each of our batteries, we'll be using one of these units that I also got through AliExpress. It's specifically built for lithium iron phosphate 4-cell batteries, and it can handle up to 120 amps of charge or discharge current. It also includes a battery temperature sensor so it can shut off charging in really cold or really hot temperatures to prevent damage. But the best feature by far is this Bluetooth module that lets you program and monitor the BMS from a smartphone app. This is the best $7 you will spend in this whole project. To finish the battery, we'll also need a few other miscellaneous parts like ring terminal connectors of various sizes, heat shrink tubing, some stuff like that, but we'll go through each one of those as we go along. Safety! 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 When you're working around lithium batteries, you need to always wear safety glasses. Lithium iron phosphate cells might be safer than lithium ion cells, but they are still high energy batteries, and little mistakes can cause bad things to happen to body parts that you do not have spares of. So wear these. All right, now back to the good stuff. Before you connect any of your cells together, you need to individually check the voltages of each cell. You never want to connect two cells together that have drastically different voltages, or that could cause a rapid discharge between them that could damage the cells. Ours are really close, so we can move on to the next step of the process called top balancing our cells, which will help us get the most out of our battery pack. Top balancing is a process where you charge each of the cells to their maximum voltage before you assemble the battery pack. To visualize why we top balance cells in an RV battery, you can think of your cells kind of like buckets of water. When these buckets are made, there are slight differences in the manufacturing process, so the bucket on the right holds a little less water than the other three. Imagine that when you got these buckets, they were filled to the same height with just a little water at the factory. We can think of this like our voltage that we just measured. We have just one hose that's split equally 4 ways to fill the buckets, so when we start filling them, that smaller bucket will fill just a bit faster than the others. And when it gets close to full, we have to shut off the water hose to keep the water from overflowing that bucket. But that means that the other 3 aren't totally full yet. The height of the water, like voltage, across all the buckets never quite reaches its maximum. If instead we filled all the buckets to the top one time, that's why we call this top balancing, then as we draw down water, the smaller one will drain a little faster, but when we refill them again, they'll meet again at the top, giving us maximum total water height, or in the case of our cells, maximum total pack voltage. This top balancing process lets you get more out of your battery for a bunch of different reasons. Because we start with our battery pack at a higher voltage, we can use more of that capacity before the pack voltage drops below what our appliances expect and we have to recharge. The cells are going to wear more evenly over time, and because your converter's not having to charge them as often, it's going to last longer too. And potentially you'll get to buy a new tool for the shop, which is always kind of a cool bonus, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, we talked about what it means, but how do we do this initial top balancing of our cells? Start by arranging the cells side by side so that the positive terminals are all on one side and the negative terminals are all on the other. Then connect the cells in parallel, meaning positive to positive and negative to negative, using your bus bars. Be sure to protect the terminals you're not working with tape or something like that to reduce the risk of shorting across the battery terminals and damaging your cells. Because my kit only came with 4 bus bars, I needed to use a couple of spare battery cables to connect these last 2 cells. Once your cells are all connected in parallel, we're going to use that new tool I was talking about. It's called a constant voltage power supply. This may seem a little exotic, but they're only about 45 bucks on Amazon, and if you do get one, you can always share them with your friends when they decide to build their batteries. We'll start by setting our voltage to 3.6 volts and setting our current to maximum, and then we'll connect the leads to our battery. This will gradually and equally charge all cells to 3.6 volts. As the cells get closer to full charge, that current will gradually drop. When it gets under about 0.2 amps, stop the process. You shouldn't be surprised if this takes several days to finish. Luckily, we've got things to do, so during that big long wait, we can start working on our battery clamp. We want to build a clamp that goes all the way around the batteries and clamps here in the center. So we'll add up all the outside dimensions, allowing a little gap here for clamping and then adding a bit for each of these 2 tabs. Since it's in the process of being balanced, we'll very carefully measure the dimensions of our pack. It's 5.5 inches along this short side, but we also want to account for this little bevel in the corners, which is about a 1/2 inch wide at an angle of about 10 degrees. This long side from corner to corner is 10 1/8 inches, and we'll plan on making the bracket about 3 inches wide. I did some quick modeling of the bracket in SketchUp, which is probably overkill, but I really love being able to visualize something before I dive in and start building it. I think this looks really good, so I'm going to go ahead and start laying out my dimensions on some 22 gauge plain steel. You could also use galvanized steel or stainless if you have a big enough sheet laying around, but this is what I had access to locally. The overall size of the blank that we're cutting out is 35.5 inches long by 3 inches wide, which includes 2 inches for each of the tabs on the ends. We'll mark the locations for each bend and include the direction and angle that we want to bend each at so that we don't lose track and make a bad bend somewhere along the way. Then we'll get in a handy forearm workout by cutting it out with $3 garage sale tin snips and sheer determination. You could use a bandsaw or a cutoff wheel, but these tin snips leave a really clean edge that doesn't need nearly as much finishing. The tabs on the ends are going to get bent in the opposite direction from the rest of the bends, and that's definitely where I could easily mess it up. So I'll mark these on the other side, and as a reminder, I'll also make a note of about what I'll be trimming off later. To bend the bracket, we could use something like a bending brake, but for this project, we're going to use something that almost everybody would have in their garage, and that's a vise and a couple of pieces of angle iron. With the vise just barely loose enough for your piece to fit in between the angle iron, slide your piece into place so that the bend line is just visible above the front piece of angle iron. Then tighten up the vise to hold everything in place. Use a square to confirm that your sheet metal is at a perfect 90-degree angle to the front angle iron, and then bend the sheet metal, applying pressure across the whole top part as you bend. Use the heel of your hand or a soft mallet to finish the bend, in this case just about 10 degrees shy of a full 90. To make the little bends that fit the bevels in the battery, say that 10 times fast, pull on the bracket and lightly tap the exposed corner with a hammer to coax the metal to bend. Don't hit it too hard. You don't want to put divots in the steel. You just want to encourage it to follow that direction that you're already pulling the sheet metal. For the rest of the bends, repeat this process of positioning the piece, squaring it up, and then bending. And after completing our bends, we'll quickly check its measurements, and it looks perfect. So we can go ahead and finish up with our 2 reverse bends for the tabs. Before we finish up the bracket though, we want to do a quick test fit. To do that, we're going to interrupt the balancing process momentarily and then tape up the terminals since we're working with bare steel. This fit looks great, so I think we can go ahead and finish it up. Back in the vise, we'll clamp everything up so that it's smooth across the corners of those tabs, and then we'll drill 3 holes for our clamp screws. Once we're done with that, we can trim off the excess of the tabs, knock off the edges, and clean the whole thing up a little bit. The last thing we'll do is make 2 reinforcing plates for these tabs using 1/2 by 1/8 steel stock. We'll drill holes in each one to match the holes in our tabs, and then we'll put it all together one last time to make sure everything fits. After about 5 days, the current on our power supply finally dropped to below 0.2 amps, and when I checked the voltage of the cells, they're reading 3.591 volts, which is about as close to 3.6 volts as we need to get. So now that they've finished balancing, we can go ahead and disassemble our parallel pack, again using plenty of tape for safety. While we were waiting for the balancing to finish up, we also had plenty of time to apply some black paint to the brackets and let them all dry. The first step in assembling our pack is now to rearrange the cells for a series connection. So the positive and negative posts of adjacent cells are right across from each other, with the negative terminal of the left cell, which we'll call our number 1 cell, and the positive terminal of the right cell, our number 4 cell, facing the front. Apply tape across the terminals of each cell and then lay that first cell down on your workbench. I applied some Gorilla Foam tape to each of the corners to temporarily hold the cells together and to give a little extra shock absorption between the cells when it's all assembled. Then stack your next cell on the first cell, making sure that the terminals are oriented correctly. They should be opposite of the first cell. Repeat that same process with your 3rd and your 4th cell, and then give them a good press to stick everything together. Now wrap your bracket around the pack and confirm that you'll be able to put your BMS in a location where the B- leads will be able to reach that negative terminal on the first cell. Once everything's in the right location, go ahead and install your reinforcing plates, your screws, and lock nuts. I also put some nylon spacers in between the tabs that gives them a positive surface to clamp down against. Lay the battery down on its side and then position the BMS back on the bracket so that the end with the sockets is pointing towards the terminals of the cells, and so that the shortest of those B- leads is able to reach that number 1 negative terminal. Then flip the BMS over and apply some more Gorilla Tape to the right location on the back of the BMS, and then remove the plastic. Seriously, who thought this would be the hardest part of this project? And then press the BMS into place on the bracket. If you find out later that you need to move the BMS up or down, you can change its location by moving the whole bracket up and down the pack after loosening these screws. But ours looks good, so we'll go ahead and mount that temperature probe to the battery using a couple of pieces of electrical tape, making sure that the probe comes in contact with the cells. Our next step is to measure and trim our balance leads. We'll start by plugging the balance lead into the BMS and then separating out our wires. Starting with the black wire, we'll route that wire down the middle of the battery to that first negative terminal and then trim it to length. Then with the white wire that's immediately next to the black wire in that plug, repeat that process but route it to the positive terminal on that same first cell. The next white wire routes to the positive terminal on the second cell, and the third white wire routes to the positive terminal on the third cell. The final red wire routes to our main battery positive, which is that final positive terminal on the 4th cell. We'll use these 5/16" heat shrink ring terminals on the ends of each one of these leads. Of course, my heat gun died during the first connector, so I am improvising using the lighter from our trailer. Once you're done, set the whole BMS balanced lead assembly aside, and then we can tackle our main battery connections. These 3 leads marked B- need to all connect to the same negative terminal on the first cell. We could either bundle them all into one big connector, or we could use 3 separate connectors, 1 per wire. In either case, you don't want to use these little guys. You want to use something more like these copper ring terminals. They're pretty simple to install. Just strip the wire to length, add a piece of heat shrink tubing, crimp the terminal, and then apply some heat. Repeat for the other 2 wires, remembering to put the heat shrink on before you crimp it. Oh, never mind. These 3 leads are done, so let's move on to the 3 marked P-. For this one, I'm going to try that single terminal approach. First, I'll just test fit them to make sure that they all fit inside this ring terminal, and once that's good, I'll go ahead and solder them together. Then I'll crimp the terminal in place and apply some borrowed heat shrink tubing with a buddy's borrowed heat gun. We're almost there, so now's not the time to get sloppy and have a short. Let's go ahead and wrap up that P- terminal with a bunch of tape and pull them out of the way. Grab your bus bars, bolts, and balance lead harness so we can start wiring up the battery terminals. We'll start with the main battery negative, only exposing the terminals that we're working with for safety. Slip the black balance lead and all 3 of those B- leads onto a bolt, and then thread it into the cell 1 negative terminal, making sure that balance lead's on the top of the stack. Then lay your first white balance lead on one end of a bus bar, insert the bolt, and then thread it into the cell 1 positive terminal. Thread a second bolt into the other end of the bus bar to make sure that that bus bar can't accidentally rotate on us. Repeat that same process with the second white lead and a bus bar, threading it into the cell 2 positive terminal and the cell 3 negative terminal, and the third white lead connecting that wire to the cell 3 positive terminal and cell 4 negative. And finally, just attach that red lead by itself for now with a bolt to the cell 4 positive terminal. Move your balance lead terminals so that they're sitting at a 90-degree angle to the bus bars so that they can fit through these little notches that are built into these terminal caps. Once you've got that in place, you're ready to tighten all your bolts to the manufacturer's spec. When tightening these bolts though, do not use something like this. This wrench could swing around and cause a short between the 2 terminals while you're tightening the bolts. I always use a ratchet with an extension and possibly even a deep socket. You could also put electrical tape or even a length of heat shrink tubing around the handle for extra safety. Now just add a few zip ties to finish it off, and we're about ready to bring this battery to life. Our last step is to install that Bluetooth module that we talked about earlier. If you didn't get the Bluetooth module, stop what you're doing and go order that Bluetooth module. Just plug the Bluetooth module into the port on the BMS, route it in a safe location, and then tape it into place. Add the battery terminal covers for a clean appearance, and then plug in the BMS balance lead, and it's time to teach this pile of parts to be a battery. On your iPhone, go to the App Store and download and install the Shaosheng BMS. If you didn't quite catch that spelling, don't worry, I put it down in the description. When you first open the app, you'll see this fake demo device, so tap this button down at the bottom to hide that. That just leaves the Shaosheng BMS, which is our battery. If we tap on that battery, it'll load up the data and we'll see some really cool stuff. At the top, we can see some details like the pack voltage of 13.99 volts and the percentage of charge. It also shows whether the battery is charging or discharging and how much power is going into or coming out of the batteries. The percentage value is wrong right now because the BMS comes with some factory config settings that aren't quite right for our batteries, but we'll fix that in a second. We can also see the cell temperature reading and the BMS temperature and the individual cell voltages down to the thousandth of a volt. That's awesome. Once we get this set up, not knowing how much power we have left is a thing of the past. This is so exciting. Let's start configuring the BMS by tapping the config button. And then I'll rename my BMS to something like Cal Battery 1 so I can tell this one apart from my upcoming second battery. You can change the temperature units to Fahrenheit if you want to, but I'm cool with Celsius. We all need practice, right? So I'll leave that. That's all there is to renaming the battery, so next tap that BMS settings icon. This screen shows every setting that can be configured for the battery for cell voltages and charging behaviors. When you tap the BMS read icon, that will load in all of the currently used settings from the BMS. We're going to make changes to quite a few of these settings, so I'll list the complete list in the description below. Anytime you make a change to one of these settings, the nice thing is it shows in yellow so you know what you've modified. The capacity configuration settings section is what's used by the BMS to calculate and display those informational values like the percentage of charge and stuff we saw on that first page. I updated the battery capacity setting to 100,000 milliamp hours, which is the same as 100 amp hours. If your battery is a different size than mine, you'll have to set this to your value. So if you had like a 75 amp hour battery, you'd put in 75,000 milliamp hours. I also updated the settings for cycle capacity and the voltages at various states of charge based on some stuff I found on the internet, so I'll include those below as well. Farther down the page is the protections area where you can set things like the high and low voltage settings for charging and discharging, and also your high and low temperature protections. Once you're happy with the new settings, tap Save Configuration and then give your new configuration a name that makes sense, like today's date or the main reason for your change or something like that, and then tap Save. So far, nothing we've done has actually been written to the BMS yet, which is good because that means if you accidentally change one of these values, you're not going to toast something. So we need to go back one step and then tap Write BMS. That'll start sending the new settings to the BMS, and as it does, you'll see that those yellow highlights disappear one by one. Now if we go back to the main screen, because we fixed that battery capacity setting, we can see that that percentage of charge is now reading right. And that's it, we have a working battery. So exciting. This turned out just like the plan, and the wiring is clean and neat, and there's no baling wire anywhere and only a little bit of intentional electrical tape. But as you can see, that wasn't too hard. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll start working on the battery enclosure and installing it in the RV, and I'll upgrade the RV's converter to support charging lithium batteries. I'll include a complete list of all the parts that we used in building this battery this week in the description below. If you haven't seen the last video and you're wondering about why we made certain decisions that we did or some of the terminology we used, go check that video out. Also, if you have any questions about anything you saw today, feel free to ask those in the comments. And as far as the rest of that stuff, you know the drill, like, subscribe, all of that. And I'll be back with more content soon to try to answer that age-old question: how hard could it be? See you soon.